Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is where we take a whole stack of sources, articles, transcripts, notes, and, we try to turn all that information overload into actual knowledge.
And today, we are wading directly into a pretty volatile space.
Yeah, the intersection of pop culture, global politics, and social media, it's a lot.
It is. We have a fascinating, and I have to say, a very contentious set of materials today. It all centers around these incredibly charged political statements made by two globally recognized pop stars.
That's right, the American singer Billie Eilish and the Swedish artist Zara Larsson.
Right. And the core of what we're looking at, it's really this one highly critical commentary that just zeroed in on their recent Instagram posts that were, they were basically political manifestos.
So our mission here, and this is for you listening, is pretty substantial. We need to quickly but really thoroughly break down the core claims these celebrities.
And they touch on everything. U.S. immigration law, criminal justice reform, all the way to the real intricacies of European economic model, like social democracy.
And critically, we have to look at the powerful, often really opposing counterarguments and the cultural critiques that our source commentary brings up.
Exactly. The challenge is to dissect all these specific claims, about U.S. agencies, about foreign social systems, and to analyze the rhetoric without us taking a side.
Yeah, we're here to convey the whole spectrum of ideas, and that includes the very charged language used by the critics.
Precisely. And the common thread here, the thing that really unites Eilish and Larsson, even though they're from different countries, it's their intense focus on U.S. immigration policy.
Specifically, the agency Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
Yeah, its very existence and its actions. Yeah. This isn't just some side comment for them. It's like a foundational argument in both of their big public statements.
And when a celebrity uses their platform like this, it just transforms these really complex policy
debates that usually just live in think tanks or, on C-SPAN.
Exactly. And it turns them into these huge cultural firestorms that hundreds of millions of people see instantly.
Which means we have to understand not just the policies, but the language, the tactics they're using to frame their argument.
And as our source material points out, it's often more about rhythm and making a viral statement than a reasoned debate.
It is. And for a lot of people, this is the main way they're going to encounter these topics. So we really owe it to you, the listener, to give you the intellectual depth behind the headline.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's slow it down a bit and start with the first case, Billie Eilish and her very direct call to abolish.
So Billie Eilish, she's an American artist, and she's been outspoken about U.S. politics for a while now. But the specific posts she shared recently on Instagram they were particularly pointed.
Yeah, a total immediate rejection of the agency.
Completely. The source quotes her directly on, and it's presented as, the definitive statement of her position. One of her posts defined IC in terms that are pretty hard to ignore.
It read, IC is a federally funded and supported terrorist group under the Department of Homeland Security that has done nothing to make our streets safer.
To call a major federal agency a terrorist group to a massive global following, that is just an extraordinary political accusation.
It really is. And the source commentary was quick to jump on that to analyze the rhetorical structure of that specific post.
Yeah, because it ended with this repetitive phrase, enough is enough, enough is enough, enough is enough.
Right. And the commentary doesn't see that as just, frustration. They see it as a tactic.
A classic agitator-activist tact is the phrase they used.
Okay, so if the goal isn't persuasion through detailed policy, then why is that specific repetitive mantra why is that
Well, the source material suggests that modern online activism really thrives on simplification and repetition. They argue that activists, quote, love mantras that they just copy and paste over and over again.
Because the goal isn't to build a case that can withstand scrutiny.
Exactly. The objective is to create a rhythmic, easily shareable, instantly digestible slogan. It's more like a chant than an argument. It's a psychological tool.
So it's designed to signal your ideological purity, maybe shut down dissent, and just overwhelm the conversation with this one repeated idea.
You've got it. It's a mechanism for demanding change by using this constant rhythmic repetition as a form of nonverbal pressure and mass signaling. It feels less like a policy suggestion and more like an unavoidable declaration.
And because it's repetitive, it's sticky. It's easy for followers to just pick it up and spread it instantly. It's built for virality, not logic.
It turns a policy critique into a social media movement.
And Eilish didn't just stop at the strong rhetoric. She followed it up with a very specific data-backed call to action.
With some tragic figures attached. She posted about specific fatalities, including the case of Renee Good, who was allegedly shot by an ICE officer in Minneapolis. But she also compiled these broader data points to really reinforce her demand.
Her demand to Abolish IC.
Yes, she listed these really striking fatality figures. She claimed that 32 people had allegedly died in IC custody in the year 2025, and 2 people were allegedly killed by ICE in 2026.
And the source commentary, while it's reporting these figures as part of her narrative, it notes the impact that claims like that have.
Oh, a profound impact, especially when you pair them with the charge that ICE is a terrorist group. I mean, whether those numbers are fully verified or not in that moment, the immediate public impact is immense. It provides what looks like a factual basis for this very emotional call to action.
Her final demand was just completely unequivocal.
Yep, this needs to end today. Abolish IC.
The source did, however, give a little bit of context for her involvement.
They did. And it's important. They acknowledge that since she is an American citizen, she has an inherent right to express her beliefs about the U.S. political system and its agencies, no matter how aggressive or inflammatory those beliefs might be.
And that acknowledgement is important because it sets a baseline for, legitimacy of engagement.
It's a foundational right. But that distinction becomes absolutely critical as we pivot to our second case study, Zara Larsson.
Because Zara Larsson is not an American.
She's not. But she decided to launch an even broader political manifesto directly into the U.S. discourse.
And this is where the source material gets intensely critical. It really focuses on her Swedish citizenship as a major point of contention.
The source provides some very strong and, often derogatory context for Larsson. They describe her as a pop star who had been, quote, tragically irrelevant for years upon years.
Wow.
They frame her rise as having just barely scraped her way out of what is called the IKEA Asylum, suggesting this recent, unexpected return to the mainstream.
So the idea is that the second her new music, the Midnight Sun album, got some attention, she suddenly felt emboldened to butt into our national discourse.
That's the framing, despite the obvious geographic and jurisdictional separation.
That initial framing feels purely rhetorical, though. It's designed to kind of delegitimize her before you even get to her actual points.
I think that's a fair reading. The source uses it for delegitimization. They present it as a sort of cultural observation that celebrities, particularly ones who've just had a career revival, often mistake that new attention for moral or political authority.
So the underlying criticism is just that she's an outsider commenting on domestic U.S. issues, and so her qualifications are suspect.
Especially since she comes from a system that is fundamentally different from the U.S.
And ZL's Instagram statement was definitely designed to maximize provocation. It spanned a huge range of controversial topics in just one post.
Oh, it was a list built to grab attention, to signal alignment with a whole bunch of progressive causes at once. The statement read, I love immigrants, I love criminals, I love trans people, I love abortions, I love queers, I love slutty women, I love contraception, I love welfare, I love socialism, I effing hate ICE.
It's a global political and social manifesto, just condensed into a few rapid-fire lines.
And it explicitly challenges traditional moral and legal boundaries at every step.
Okay, her mention of I love socialism is the perfect pivot point for us. We need to really explain the specific system she comes from, the Nordic model, because the source goes into detail, and it's often so misunderstood in U.S. political debate.
This is what's genuinely fascinating. The source gives this detailed correction of the popular American perception. When people in the U.S. hear socialism or social democracy in Sweden, they immediately picture this, like the centrally controlled economy where the government runs all the industry.
Right.
The source says that is profoundly inaccurate. Sweden is described as having a highly capitalist model with minimal government intervention and private business.
In fact, they argue it scores higher than America on global indices measuring economic freedom.
Exactly.
Wait, hold on. That needs more explanation. To score higher than the U.S. on the Economic Freedom Index, which measures things like rule of law, regulatory efficiency, market openness. How does that possibly coexist with taxes that are, 40 to 60%?
That is the Nordic paradox.
Yeah.
And the source spends a lot of time unpacking. The Nordic model isn't a rejection of capitalism. It's capitalism in, hyperdrive.
Okay.
It's designed to produce vast amounts of wealth that is then aggressively redistributed through a very robust state.
Yeah.
To score high on that index means that starting a business, getting permits, running your day-to-day corporate operation. It's often less burdened by bureaucracy in Sweden than it is in the U.S. Corporate taxes are competitive. The culture is highly pro-innovation, pro-market.
So low barriers to entry for businesses, aggressive promotion of international trade, highly efficient markets. That's the capital.
That's the engine. And that capitalism is what aggressively funds the high social welfare system. The source is clear that the cost is borne almost entirely by the individual taxpayer.
Through those exceptionally high income and consumption taxes.
We're talking effective marginal tax rates of 40, 50, even 60% of your income going to the government. You're encouraged to make a ton of money, but a huge mandatory piece of it goes directly to fund cradle-to-grave social services.
Healthcare, education, unemployment benefits.
All of it. It's a compact between the citizen and the state. We'll let you operate a hyper-efficient market, but in return, we demand a major share of your productivity to ensure social equity.
And the source emphasizes that the success of this system really relies on two factors that are basically non-replicable when you compare it to the United States.
And we absolutely cannot ignore the scale difference. The source insists on this, and it's vital.
The U.S. is a continental nation, hundreds of millions of people.
Right. And Sweden, according to the source, has a small population of only about 10 million people. That makes it comparable in size to a U.S. state like Michigan, North Carolina, Jersey.
And the argument is that managing a high-trust, high-tax welfare state is just inherently easier when your bureaucracy only has to manage 10 million.
10 million people who, historically, were highly agreeable on fundamental cultural norms.
Which is the second factor. Cultural homogeneity. The source says Sweden has historically been a monocultural country. How does that impact the social contract?
Well, a monocultural society often implies very high levels of social trust. You're much more willing to pay 50% in tax when you fundamentally trust that the person receiving the benefit shares your cultural values and your work ethic.
And the source's argument is that the vast, diverse, highly fragmented United States, with its long history of internal political and cultural friction, just cannot replicate that high.
Not at the scale needed for the Nordic model to function. The systems are incompatible because of scale and culture.
And this context is really the foundation for the source's very aggressive critique of any European involvement in U.S. politics.
They take a very hard line here. They argue that Europeans are pathologically obsessed with U.S. politics and our domestic affairs.
And the reason they give is provocative.
Simple and provocative. They claim the U.S. is the world superpower and the only country that actually matters. Therefore, they say, Europeans cannot shut up about our political system because they see U.S. policy as defining the entire global context.
Instead of focusing on their own domestic.
And ZL herself kind of gave evidence for that, for internal domestic issues, by acknowledging the recent political shift in Sweden.
She did. She noted that the right-wing party is currently in power
and their goal is explicitly to roll back the immigration policies from around 2015 and 2016. Their focus now is cutting down on illegal immigration, offering incentives for voluntary repatriation to migrants.
So the implication she's struggling with is that Sweden's previously very liberal immigration caused massive, decisive internal backlash from native.
And the source offers a very potent, though highly charged, explanation for that swing to right-wing populism.
What's their take?
They directly attribute the shift to native-born Swedes who, they claim, have been terrorized for a decade by foreigners who oppose their traditional way of life. The source claims Sweden is currently plagued with their own migrant crisis and is turning into what they provocatively called a third world shithole.
Wow. And that's because of voting mindsets that they say prioritize the welfare of immigrants over native citizens.
So that creates this critical contradiction. ZL is advocating for a system whose liberal policies, the source argues, have directly led to the rise of the right-wing government. She's now criticizing for crumbling the social democracy.
It suggests a real disconnect between the political ideals she supports and the actual social outcome in her own country.
It absolutely does. And that tension is a recurring theme in the source's critique of celebrity activism.
Okay, that dense context brings us to the line that caused the biggest firestorm and required her to immediately clarify ZL's declaration, "I love criminals."
And this is where the personal anecdote she used serves as this profound pivot in her whole essay.
It's a classic rhetorical move, right? You use a deeply personal, relatable story to humanize a really abstract and often frightening political concept like criminality.
Exactly. She justified it by talking about her boyfriend, who she described in these overwhelmingly positive terms: sweet, loving, kind, caring, compassionate, smart, generous, talented, thoughtful.
But this sweet, loving, kind, caring, compassionate, smart, generous, talented, thoughtful man has a problem with the U.S.
He does. He has a criminal record that has barred him from visiting her in the U.S. for almost 6 years.
And the source details the crime.
Yeah, smoking a little spliff marijuana over 6 years ago. ZL noted that the record is officially gone under Swedish law, probably expunged or past the statute of limitations, but the rigid U.S. system maintains the bar to entry.
And she uses this really personal example of bureaucratic inflexibility to launch a much bigger
critique of the entire U.S. criminal justice system. She expands the anecdote into this broad political argument about the scale and the racial impact of the U.S. prison system.
She concluded that the focus should be on the thousands and thousands of people who are jailed or imprisoned for nonviolent crimes, like minor drug offense.
And she specifically claims that these harsh policies disproportionately affect Black and brown people, and she lays the blame squarely on the racist 1980s policies of Ronald Reagan for, quote, effing up community.
So she's using her boyfriend's minor offense as a lens to condemn the entire drug war era.
That's the precise mechanism of her argument. But then she followed up with one of the most inflammatory comparisons in her entire essay, a comment designed purely to shock and polarize.
I think I know which one you mean.
She states, and I'm quoting directly from the source, "I don't know about y'all, but I'd rather have someone smoking crack on my couch than an effing icy agent."
And that line drew immediate and severe commentary from the source.
Aimed directly at her potential lack of real-world understanding. The source sharply questions her lived experience, arguing that she has likely never hung out with an actual crackhead.
The argument being if she actually did host someone suffering from a severe crack addiction,
her property would be gone, or
Yeah.
you're gone. The implication is that she's minimizing the actual destructive, often violent consequences of hard drug addiction in exchange for a shocking rhetorical flourish.
a flourish that signals her moral alignment with a far-left ideology.
And the source offers a political calculus for this. They argue she is simply spewing bullshit to gain validation, specifically from far-left stan Twitter accounts who are eating all of this up and praising Zara Larsson.
So they see it as a calculated move for social currents, playing a role for a niche audience that's willing to overlook the practical realities for the sake of ideology.
And the commentary channel compares musicians to act. They say musicians often get less pushback because their audience just sees mother is mothering and queen behavior.
Whereas actors have to be more cautious because they need to appeal to a broad demographic to sell movie tickets.
Right. The musician, they suggest, can just live off the demographic of those highly ideological niche social media accounts. The financial independence of a pop star allows them to operate outside the pressures of mass market appeal.
So they can make increasingly radical statements without fear of commercial reprisal, as long as they keep that core fan base engaged.
Exactly.
And to double down on this whole complexity of criminality, she then followed up with another essay, this time bringing up Donald Trump.
Yes, she pivoted the discussion from drug users and the poor to political figures. She leveraged the political moment, arguing that Trump supporters were being hypocritical.
Hypocritical to be upset with her for loving her boyfriend whose crime was so minor when they voted for Trump, who at the time she wrote the essay had 34 felonies to be president.
The comparison she drew was stark. She was highlighting this perceived disparity in justice. Some people go to jail for shoplifting or smoking weed. Other people get to run a country for worse.
But there's a critical detail source highlight, a potential bias or oversight on her part.
A huge one. They point out that ZL failed to acknowledge that Trump actually lowered the classification of marijuana during his time in office.
So the source suggests that if she truly held the anti-drug war position she claimed to, she should have shown some intellectual honesty.
And given him props for that specific policy action, regardless of her overall political disagreement with him.
Okay, so she uses the Trump comparison to introduce a more nuanced perspective on conviction and morality that goes beyond policy.
Exactly. Her core moral point was that a conviction doesn't always equal a bad person, and on the flip side, many bad people often walk completely free.
And she uses a really powerful, sobering example for this.
A very powerful. She states that if you ask any woman, it would only take 2 or 3 inquiries until you find someone who can tell you about rape and or abuse from their own partner or ex, and he's not behind bars even if she went to the...
Which shifts the focus from minor, victimless drug offense, where she thinks the punishment veer, to serious, often gendered violent crimes that frequently go on.
And that serves as a rhetorical bridge, leading directly into her argument about the legal distinctions of immigration status itself.
Which is a key legal point in our sources and requires some precise...
This is the critical legal distinction ZL raised. She frames her argument around the word, claiming it's bonkers to justify the unjust treatment of unauthorized immigrants simply based on that one word.
And specific legal argument she makes is foundational.
It is. She argues that staying in the U.S. without authorization is fundamentally a civil violation, not a criminal offense.
Okay, so what does that mean in practice? Civil violation versus criminal.
The practical difference is substantial. A civil violation is typically a matter of regulatory compliance or administrative law. You might be fined or deported, but you're not inherently subject to the full weight of the criminal justice, which is designed for violence.
So she's arguing that the dehumanization and the intense punitive actions taken against unauthorized immigrants are just completely disproportionate to the nature of frack.
That's her entire point. The act of being present without pay shouldn't automatically trigger this severe criminal-like enforcement apparatus that involves family separation and lengthy detention.
But the source material immediately pushed back on this, right? They provided several counterpoints to the civil versus criminal distinction.
Immediately. The first counterpoint is that while unauthorized presence might be civil, entering the country illegally often involves subsequent actions that are explicitly criminal.
For example,
to get a job or access services, you often have to get a false or misused social security number. That constitutes fraud And that is criminal. So the source argues that just using the civil violation defense ignores the compounded criminal activity required to live and work here without authorization.
The source also raised a powerful and often overlooked economic argument about the status.
Yeah, they argue that when someone enters the country illegally and gets a job, they essentially become a slave class. Because they lack legal protection and the same rights as a citizen, they're ripe targets for exploitation by unscrupulous employers.
Employers who know they can't report workplace violations or demand fair wages without risking.
Right. The source frames this exploitation as a point that bears repeating because the economic vulnerability of these individuals is just immense.
But then the source presents a counterpoint to that, a much more cynical isolation.
It's a sharp pivot. They offer the viewpoint that many citizens don't really feel bad for them. This perspective is rooted in the belief that people come to the U.S. primarily to siphon off of our resources and enjoy everything that Americans have built, only to send their money back home as remittance.
Which the source interprets as a lack of investment or care for the U.S. itself. The viewpoint is summarized with the line, "Don't care about us, so I don't see why we should care about them."
It's a very clear articulation of an America First stance on resource allocation. They briefly mention the role of trafficking in coyotes, acknowledging the complexity, but that's the core of that particular argument.
That brings us to the next section, the capitalism-socialism divide and the deep dive into U.S. healthcare, which is where ZL returns to defending her economic ideology.
Right. After that initial list, she clearly felt the need to clarify her "I love social," especially given the context we just discussed about the highly capitalist Nordic model.
She explicitly stated she doesn't live in a socialist country. She explained she lives in a social democracy,
which is characterized by that strong welfare system and high government trust, all built on that foundation of capital.
And she gave an almost utopian definition of what she thinks true socialism is.
She called it a dream of equality for all. But she shows this measure of real-world cynicism, admitting that achieving this ideal is almost impossible because of the inevitable reality of corrupt government and leaders.
And at the same time, she's lamenting that her own system, the Swedish social democracy, is sadly crumbling under the policies of the current right-leaning government.
Right. And she also had to address that common critique thrown at wealthy activists. The "you got money, shut up" argument, the idea that she's too insulated to understand poverty.
She confronted that directly.
She did. She said she probably gets told that 10,000 times a day. She states her motivation clearly. She talks about these issues because she cares about human beings. She acknowledges her wealth, saying, "You're right, I don't have to talk about it."
And she confirms she'll always be able to afford going to the hospital, paying for a good school, for food, etc., because of her financial status.
But her core conviction is that she just doesn't want to live in a society where healthcare and education are privatized and only for people who can pay for it. That's the moral anchor for her activism, despite her personal affluence.
And once again, the source felt compelled to reassert that fundamental difference in scale between the U.S. and Swedish systems.
It's a persistent reminder. The United States has hundreds of millions of people compared to Sweden's 10 million. You can't just copy and paste these systems.
So the source then uses this discussion of welfare and social systems as a pivot point to analyze the U.S. healthcare paradox. And this is maybe the most nuanced economic critique from the commentary, Jim.
It really is. They make a very strong, specific claim. They assert that the U.S. actually has the best specialized healthcare in the world.
And they back this up by saying people come from all over the world to see U.S. doctors and hospitals for specialized treatment. The quality of the cutting-edge care itself is not.
So if we have the best specialized care, where does the paradox come in? Where does it fail these so-called peasant class?
The source argues the problem is not the medical care, it's the insurance industry built around. The failure lies in the complex pricing, the lack of transparency, denial of coverage, high deductibles, catastrophic coverage cap, all the things that leave people with crushing, inescapable debt.
And they say that's a vastly different thing from the quality of the actual medical practitioner.
Which leads to a powerful critique of the political right's messaging on this issue.
The source argues that the political right, to their own detriment, often ignores the extreme economic vulnerability of the lower income population, the peasant class, who are frequently one unexpected illness away from total bankruptcy.
Even with insurance.
Even with insurance. The source suggests that the standard conservative argument that the free market will eventually fix it sounds completely hollow when a person is staring down a $50,000 bill for an emergency appendectomy.
And the ultimate political of ignoring this vulnerability, according to the source.
It's a huge political blind spot that could lead to radicalization. They argue that if this economic stress continues, people won't turn back to the free market. They believe the next generation will think that communism will solve these problems.
And while they immediately dismiss communism as something that will not work,
they highlight that there is a significant messaging problem on the conservative. They're inadvertently creating a pathway for radical leftist ideology by failing to fix the debt crisis created by healthcare costs.
It's an insightful analysis. The system produces world-class care, but the cost structure creates an economic instability that could push future generations toward radical political ideas. The failure is administrative and financial, not medical.
Which brings us to the most controversial section of the source material, the direct cultural and moral critique of Zara Larsson.
This is where the source shifts into its highest gear of moral.
Yeah, they use highly charged language. They begin with a core identity critique, labeling ZL as the quintessential awful, affluent white liberal female, and notably a Jezebel.
And they explicitly state they do not use that term lightly, implying it carries severe moral and, for them, theological.
They then reinterpret her original list, not as a list of policy preferences, but as a deliberate endorsement of what they call biblical evil, based on their religious world. Her support for queers and trans people is interpreted as supporting sodomy and when people mutilate their bodies. Her embrace of criminals is seen as validating crime. It transforms a political position into a moral declaration against traditional religious values.
Okay, let's analyze the reaction to "I love abortions." This is where the source takes an extremely hardline moral position that we need to frame carefully as the commentary's own.
Yes, they shift into this highly charged moral language, claiming the pro-choice movement has fundamentally changed its stand. They argue that the movement has completely abandoned the previous, more moderate position of safe, legal, and rare.
And what do they claim the movement stands for now?
The source asserts that the movement has fully admitted that they just love killing babies and find no greater joy than to tear babies limb from limb. This is the uncompromising moral interpretation they're presenting.
So not about necessity or tragedy, but about actively celebrating the termination of life. They claim the moderates within the movement have been silent in favor of.
It's an aggressive moral interpretation, moving the conversation from legal status to what they see as an act of moral depravity.
And the source concludes this intense segment with a direct rebuttal to a social media comment that tried to soften ZL's message by invoking scripture.
Right. Someone commented online suggesting ZL's positions were okay because Jesus associated with all those people, criminals, prostitutes, and so on.
And the source called this rewriting the Bible to fit my political narrative.
And they pushed back with 3 specific counterarguments to what they called Jesus fan fiction.
What was the first?
First, they argued Jesus did not hang out with unrepentant prostitutes or affirm that what they were doing was okay. The source implies he was calling them to repentance, not endorsing their lifestyle.
The second counterargument addressed trans.
Regarding trans people, the source argues that this community didn't exist as a defined marginalized group in the first century. They dismissively claimed it was just common knowledge that there were men out there who like wearing women's clothes and doing butt stuff, suggesting the modern framing of identity is anachronistic when applied to Scripture.
And the third counterargument circles back to the economic.
The third point was definitive. Jesus was not into socialism. They argue that the principles of charity and community in Scripture are based on voluntary giving and individual responsibility, which they see as fundamentally different from a mandated government-run redistribution.
And that serves as a final, direct rejection of any attempt to lend theological support to her platform.
Exactly.
Wow. That brings us to the end of this incredibly detailed deep dive. We started with 2 pop stars and ended up debating U.S. legal definitions, the history of Swedish economics, the U.S. healthcare insurance paradox, and biblical the layers.
It was a layered examination. We exposed the complex mechanics behind these highly polarized views on U.S. immigration and criminal justice. We contrasted the economic reality of the Nordic model aggressive capitalism funding high welfare with these populist, often ill-defined concepts of socialism.
And we highlighted that massive clash between personal celebrity anecdote and the severe moral and political critique found in the commentary.
For you, the listener, navigating these complex politicized topics really requires digging past the headline, past the viral chant. Our mission was to show you the multiple layers that underpin these seemingly simple social media posts.
The personal anecdote used to humanize a system like the boyfriend's weed chart, the structural differences between economy scale, and the specific legal and moral definitions, civil versus criminal, the infanticide claim. The challenge is to hold all those conflicting ideas in your head.
And that juxtaposition of the hyper-specialized world-class U.S. system and the widespread economic stress it creates, that leads us to a final provocative thought for you to consider.
The discussion about the U.S. having the best specialized healthcare in the world, but it's undermined by an insurance industry that leaves the vast lower and middle income majority one paycheck away from ruin.
Coupled with the source's fear that the next generation might turn to communism, it raises a fundamental question. In a world of such extreme wealth and specialized knowledge, where innovation thrives but access is restricted, how does a society structure its essential services, like healthcare, to maintain both innovation and equity without resorting to radical systemic change.
That is something for you to mull over as you continue your own deep dives into the cost of complexity.